August 9th, 378, a Roman emperor and his entire high command lay dead on the field. Their enemy? A starving mass of Gothic refugees who had begged for asylum. This entire catastrophic war was completely avoidable. Here, this is the step-by-step story of how Roman arrogance engineered one of its worst defeats ever. Shermundorm. This chain of disaster begins in the late 4th century after Christ. The Roman Empire, exhausted and scarred, still projected an image of absolute power over the known world. Was, however, a fading image, a glorious sunset mistaken for a new dawn. Its moment of unchallenged dominance had passed. Friday, the legions no longer marched forth to conquer. They stood guard, perpetually bracing for impact. The empire of aggression had become an empire of defense. Its frontiers, stretching thousands of miles, were under constant, grinding pressure. In Europe, the borders were relentlessly stalked by barbarian tribes, their names a litany of growing threats. In the east, the sophisticated and powerful Sassanid Persians watched Rome's every move, an equal rival waiting for any sign of weakness. The great machine was slowing down. And yet, even in its twilight hours, the empire still produced brilliant, capable men. Valentinian the Great was one such man, a throwback to a more glorious past. He was a ruler of fierce tenacity, a soldier emperor whose effectiveness was as renowned as his temper. Valentinian understood the beast he commanded. In his time, the Roman Empire had evolved into a machine of staggering complexity. The old heart of Rome itself was no longer the center of gravity. The eastern part of the empire, with its ancient cities, vast populations, and immense wealth, had grown in importance until it eclipsed the west. In Raycorn, its population was booming, its cities vibrant, its coffers full. This enormous territory, this beating heart of imperial power, could not be managed by one man, especially not from distant Trier or Milan. The idea that a co-emperor was needed to help govern this vast state gained strength day by day. It was no longer a suggestion, it was a political necessity. Valentinian, pragmatic as ever, was forced to yield to this popular and practical demand. He chose his own brother, Flavius Julius Valens, and named him co-emperor for the eastern part of the empire. Valens was a poor choice, but a safe one for Valentinian. He was a man defined not by his own talents, but by his relationship with his brilliant brother. He was loyal, which was paramount, but he was deeply inexperienced as a leader. He ascended to the purple without the long military or administrative apprenticeship that had forged rulers like Valentinian. Almost immediately, his authority was tested. A usurper named Procopius, a distant relative of the old Constantinian dynasty, rose in revolt and proclaimed himself emperor in Constantinople. The rebellion was serious, threatening to sever the East from Valens' shaky grasp. Valens, panicking and unsure, was nearly ready to abdicate. But if Valens himself was not a capable leader, he possessed one saving grace. He had inherited very good generals. These seasoned commanders, loyal to the imperial office, took charge of the campaign.
We cut off their retreat.
They methodically hunted Procopius, cornered his forces, and ultimately defeated and captured the usurper. Surely, Valens, who had contributed little to the victory, nonetheless reaped its political rewards. Surely, the revolt was successfully crushed. But the waters remained turbulent. However, watching this internal Roman struggle with greedy eyes were the Goths. Hornas, sensing opportunity in the chaos, they soon began making incursions into Thrace, testing the newly secured defenses. Once again, Valens' generals managed to handle the setbacks. Nocturne, they repelled the Gothic raids, driving them back across the Danube. And with each victory won by his subordinates, Valens' personal popularity, and more dangerously, his self-regard, began to increase. He began to see himself not as the fortunate brother of Valentinian, but as a capable emperor in his own right. Emboldened by these successes, he now sought a true legacy. He turned his gaze to the east, to the perennial Persian threat. He began to plan a massive, glorious campaign against the Sassanids, a war that would secure his eastern frontier and write his name alongside Trajan and Aurelian. It was a campaign that could never be carried out. The reason for this ultimate failure was not the Persians. The reason was the Goths. The year was 376, a cataclysm unseen in generations was unfolding in the vast cold plains north of the Black Sea. A nomadic people known only as the Huns, emerging from the deep steppe, were causing unparalleled havoc across the great European plain. They were a force of nature, destroying everything in their path and displacing entire nations. Fleeing this terror, an enormous Gothic force, led by a chieftain named Fritigern, appeared on the banks of the Danube River. This was not a raiding party, it was an entire people on the move, a desperate mass of men, women, and children. They stopped at the frontier, the river that separated the barbarian world from Roman civilization, and they asked for permission to enter. They petitioned to be settled within Roman territory, offering their services as soldiers in exchange for safety from the Huns. This was the moment the crisis began. At that time, the co-emperor Valens was far away on the eastern frontier. He was in Antioch, deeply immersed in gathering troops and supplies for his grand Persian adventure. The Gothic request arrived at the worst possible time, a distraction from his dreams of Eastern glory. Sarkiyuri, when he learned of the petition, he perceived it not as a humanitarian crisis, but as a great threat. A whole armed nation wished to enter his borders. He was forced to modify his plans. The situation was delicate in the extreme, and the man on the spot was dangerously unequal to the task. Samarnium on the Danube frontier was, at that moment, very poorly defended. The provincial governor, a man named Lupicinus, had only a few thousand soldiers under his command. He was an administrator, not a general, and his troops were garrison units, not a field army. Valens, aware of his frontier's weakness from hundreds of miles away, knew he could not fight Fritigern and the Huns at the same time. He had no good options. Reluctantly, he gave his consent. He agreed to Fritigern's petition and ordered Lupicinus to allow the Goths to pass into Roman territory. This decision, born of weakness, had an immediate and serious setback. When the rumor of Roman weakness and Roman permission spread to other Gothic groups also fleeing the Huns, they didn't wait for their own treaties. They simply began to cross the Danube without asking for any permission at all. The frontier dissolved into chaos. It was certainly not the first time barbarians had beset the Roman Empire, but this time was different. This time, the Roman governor on site completely lacked the resources to manage the harrowing situation. Lupicinus was overwhelmed, and in his panic, he made the crisis infinitely worse. When Valens gave permission for the Goths to cross, he had included strict conditions. Lupicinus was tasked with enforcing this. He failed.
Finally.
The Goths, starving and desperate but not fools, negotiated and bribed the corrupt Roman officials. They flatly refused to hand over their arms, their only guarantee of safety in this new, strange land. And with Roman incompetence plain to see, they crossed the frontier anyway, their weapons still in their hands. For Lupicinus, the situation was now critical. He had a massive, armed, and hungry barbarian nation inside his province, and he had failed his emperor's first directive. He panicked. He quickly gathered all the troops he had along the Danube, stripping the garrisons bare to custody the Goths. His plan was not to feed them or settle them, but to march them under guard to the regional Roman headquarters at Marcianopolis. It was there, in a fatal display of treachery and stupidity, that Lupicinus sealed Rome's fate. He organized a great dinner, a formal banquet for Fritigern and the other Gothic leaders.
Of cooperation between us.
He intended to lull the leader into a false sense of security. As Fritigern dined, Lupicinus's soldiers surrounded the Gothic leader's personal bodyguard outside. The governor's plan was to imprison Fritigern, hoping to disarticulate his army and leave it leaderless. Far from achieving this, the plan backfired spectacularly. The Goths outside, hearing the clash of arms and realizing the betrayal, began to rebel immediately. Where the sounds of fighting echoed into the banquet hall. Lupicinus, trapped by his own failed plot, was forced to let Fritigern go free to placate the enraged mob. The release of Fritigern did not content the Goths. It only confirmed their worst fears. The Romans were not saviors. They were treacherous hosts. The Goths, now seeing the absolute weakness of the Roman position in the area, exploded with righteous fury. They began to sack the entire region, causing widespread havoc. Joram, what began as a plea for asylum had become a war of vengeance. Lupicinus, seeing the situation spiral completely out of his hands, made his final desperate move. Gathered the few thousand men at his disposal, the same men who had failed to secure the banquet, and gave chase to the barbarians near Marcianopolis. Aheno, he, the man who had failed at logistics, diplomacy, and treachery, would now try to be a general. The effort was in vain. The furious barbarian horde, fighting with the desperation of the betrayed, turned on Lupicinus's small army.
No spoken dialogue.
They vencido aplastantemente a los romanos, not just defeating them, but annihilating the force. Lupicinus, the architect of the disaster, managed to escape this contest with his life, fleeing the field in disgrace. But his personal failure was now complete. defeat of a Roman provincial army by a group of Goths who came with one hand in front and one behind was no longer a border issue. It became an urgent matter of state. Tonedin. Meanwhile, after the battle, the victorious Goths continued their course of plunder and pillage throughout the region, unopposed. Wayuan, they were no longer refugees, they were masters of Thrace. All this disastrous news soon traveled east, carried by frantic messengers to Valens in Antioch. The emperor was against the wall. His glorious Persian campaign, the dream of his legacy, evaporated in an instant. He was forced to cancel all his plans for Persia and turn his full attention and military efforts to Thrace. Meanwhile, the situation was so critical that Valens, swallowing his pride, was even forced to ask for help from the Western Emperor, Gratian. Gratian, his own nephew, had recently succeeded Valentinian. Valens requested that Gratian bring the Western legions to help him contain the Gothic catastrophe. Kamainon, the combined power of both halves of the empire would be brought to bear. But then, something inside Valens shifted. The initial panic gave way to that familiar, dangerous arrogance that his early victories had fostered. When Valens arrived in Constantinople, the capital of his empire, he was met by a populace that was restless and critical. At Ani, they saw the Goths ravaging their lands and their emperor arriving without an immediate victory. Stung by the criticism and the humiliation, Valens changed his mind. He heard reports that Gratian was on his way with the Western army.
Faster than anticipated. Gratian is almost upon us.
When he made a fatal calculation. Instead of waiting for Gratian's help, he decided to confront the Goths alone. Alconi, if he waited, the glory would be shared with his nephew. If he won now, he alone would be the savior of the East. He chose to take all the glory for himself. In this moment of supreme hubris, the fate of his army was sealed. He marched his field army out of Constantinople and headed toward Adrianople, where Fritigern's forces were last reported. On August 9th of that same year, 378 AD, the two forces finally saw each other. Makuri, the Roman army, the pride of the East, arrayed itself for battle. Fritigern, who had proven himself a capable leader, had chosen his ground well.
Wait!
The Gothic contingent had established its camp on a small elevation, a low hill that provided a significant strategic advantage. Furthermore, the barbarians had surrounded their entire camp with a defensive circle of wagons, a sort of improvised palisade. It was a fortress, a laager, from which they could fight. Their fighting force consisted of about 15,000 men. Unlike the Romans, they were well fed from their recent plunder and crucially were defending a prepared, elevated position. On the other side, Valens commanded a larger force of about 20,000 men. But these men were in a terrible state. They were utterly exhausted from marching many kilometers in the suffocating heat of the high August summer. Forsun, they arrived at the battlefield dehydrated, tired, and already at a disadvantage before the first sword was even drawn. Valens, blinded by his desire for glory, ignored the state of his men and the strength of the enemy's position. He ordered the attack. The action began. Fritigern initiated the engagement with a clever, cruel tactic. 1-1. He ordered his men to set fire to all the dry grass and scrub that lay between the two armies. A wall of choking smoke and blistering heat rolled toward the Roman lines, stinging their eyes and further sapping their energy. The Roman army, already exhausted, now had to advance through an inferno. It was in this chaos that the Roman discipline, usually ironclad, began to fray. A part of the Roman cavalry on the right wing, perhaps mistaking a signal or simply overeager, advanced without having received any order to charge. This single undisciplined act triggered a chain reaction. To make matters worse for the Romans, the cavalry on the left wing, seeing their comrades engaged on the other side of the field, also charged. Sur-le-champ, they wheeled and slammed into the Gothic right flank. The flanks were engaged without a plan. This chaotic piecemeal attack forced the hand of the commanders. Sonar, the bulk of the Roman infantry, the heavy legions, now also had to advance to support the failing cavalry charges. Much of what should have been a coordinated assault became a massive, stumbling, disorganized battle. Gaetun, the Roman army was feeding itself into the Gothic defenses piece by piece. While the cavalry charge on the left wing had some relative success, momentarily pushing back the Goths, the horsemen on the right flank, the ones who had charged first, were quickly repulsed. The failed cavalry charge left the Roman infantry on that flank exposed. Meanwhile, the struggle in the center, where the bulk of both armies clashed, seemed to be balanced. Roman discipline held, and they pushed against the Gothic line. However, the Roman infantry was at a severe disadvantage, fighting against Goths who held a more elevated position. The legions were straining uphill, every step a struggle against gravity and a prepared foe. This tactical deficit began to tell. Slowly, agonizingly, Valens' men began to cede ground. Even so, the battle remained stalled for several grueling hours, with no clear victor. The Romans were losing, but they were not broken. They were bleeding, exhausted, and fighting uphill in the smoke and heat, but the line held. It was a stalemate of mutual slaughter. And then suddenly the decisive blow fell. Several thousand barbarian horsemen appeared out of nowhere. It was a separate Gothic force, perhaps alerted by Fritigern earlier, and they arrived at the perfect, terrible moment. They smashed into the already struggling Roman flank, delivering a mortal blow to the Roman army. In a matter of minutes, Valens' forces began to fall like dominoes. The flank collapsed, and the Goths poured in from the side and rear. Sorul. A desperate attempt was made to protect the flanks, to form a new line, but there was nothing to be done. The army was surrounded, broken, and terrified. Jeroboam. What followed then was not a battle, it was an authentic carnage. The Goths, sensing total victory, showed no mercy. The Romans ended up with thousands of casualties. Colonel among the dead, lost in the sea of bodies, was the Emperor Valens himself. Certainement, His entire high command, the generals and staff officers who had followed him in his quest for glory, were also wiped out. The Battle of Adrianople, therefore, became one of the worst military defeats in the history of Rome. It was for the empire a genuine, unmitigated drama. Needless to say, the Western Emperor, Gratian, who was still marching to his uncle's aid, was informed of this disaster. He flew into an immense rage. According to the historian Zosimus, Gratian was informed by Victor, a commander of the Roman cavalry who had managed to escape the slaughter. Zosimus tells us that when Gratian was informed of such a disaster, he felt no great sadness for the loss of his uncle. This is because, and Zosimus says this textually, one and the other looked at each other with certain suspicion. This strained, jealous relationship would explain precisely why Valens acted as he did. It explains why Valens chose to fight without waiting for Gratian, a decision driven by pride that cost him his life and his army. For the next several years, the Goths completely dominated the region. They wandered at will, leaving Thrace and the surrounding provinces completely razed.